Basically, this is a book that came about because of the challenges in my relationship with my own father and wanting to build basically a community so I felt less alone in that journey. My dad and I began our process of reconciling about 4 years ago, and it went really well. And I remember learning a lot about his family and specifically his mom and dad, who died when he was 8 years old, and he was raised by his aunt. We had a very challenging relationship when we met when I was 16. And after my mom died, she died of cancer at the age of 53. That was the last time I saw my dad at the funeral for the next 15 years. So after spending some time with him, I went back home and had all of these I wish my dad moments just flood my mind, opportunities that were just never going to happen now. We were too late in our story. And as I laid there thinking through all those moments, I felt lonely. And I wanted to know from other people if they had I wish my dad stories that would help me find my own way, my own healing journey. And so I put together a list of 17 people. Michael Ray was one of those folks. And I found people who I felt like how they show up in the world said something about their backstory, whether they had healed it or not. That it's always present in wherever we are, our stories. And so with that, I interviewed everyone, and at the end of each chapter, there are takeaways written by a therapist, Kendra Frazier, who actually went to NYU here, and she lives in Charlotte now. But Michael Ray, I believe this is your first time actually preaching and using the context of your story, right? I'm curious how that felt for you.
It was a bit scary. As you know, we did an event in Los Angeles, and I'm from Los Angeles, and so I had to disclose to my mother and my sister that I was a part of this book where I was telling the truth about our relationship, my dad and I was worried about offending them, and those feelings came back in preparing for this sermon, because it's the first time I was saying it to a community that I love and trust, and it's going to be online. Yeah.
I found that with a number of people in the book. It's one thing to tell your story and know that it's going to be in the book. And then when final edits were coming across and I was sending chapters to people and they were able to read what they said, a number of people wrestled with the honesty, feeling that by telling the whole truth, I'm somehow dishonoring my parent. That most of us, at funerals and throughout life, we tell those things that are good. And we leave out the challenges. And what I had to help them understand was that in being honest about the whole story, you're not dishonoring the person. The reality is that you're showing that they were fully human. And that is actually the more loving way to present them in their challenges and in their strength. And resist the fear of shame because you're not presenting a perfect person. Did you deal with any of that tension as you shared your journey with your dad in the book of, am I honoring this relationship? And if so, what does that look like for you?
Oh, indeed. Because I knew that so much of what I shared in the sermon had happened, as I read the manuscript, I wasn't sure that it was clear, like, this is a good story. It ends well, and there was light, and it was good. And so I remember telling Romal, it's like, I'm not sure if this chapter, I want to write it so I can make it end the way I wanted it to end. And because it ends with the takeaways, Kendra brings some really hard but healing truths into the takeaway. And that's not how I would end the sermon. So, my ego was a bit caught up in that. I think I also was concerned, as I mentioned before, about how my mom and my sister particularly would feel about me telling this story, as well as my father's siblings who were still alive, and also thinking about my son and what the truth of that story might reveal and bring up for him. And was I going to be ready to hear him tell me what he wished?
You know, listening to Michael Ray share that, I remember when he flew in, I live in Atlanta, he flew to my home, and I could tell, like, he was ready to go. Like, he was ready, like, let's just get into it. And so we sat down pretty much like this with a little coffee table in between us, and I started telling him how the process would go and raised the first question. And instead of answering the first question, he said, well, the first thing you need to know is that I'm a survivor. And I was like, well, okay, like we're just off to the races here. He jumps right in with a high level of transparency and vulnerability about his own story of sexual violence. And it took me off guard. It took me off guard, one, because men don't talk about it. And that's why it's also often underreported. It also took me off guard because in 2 instances in my life, I had to fight off sexual abuse. And so now being authentic and honest with the book, I felt like now he's pulled me into having to own a part of my story that I often don't like talking about because of the fear of shame, and that I think people we inflict on ourselves unnecessarily. That's tied to what will other people think of me. And I found in that moment, like literally at the beginning of the interview, it became an opportunity to shine light on a wound for it to heal. So what was that? What compelled you to start there?
I think I actually gave you a rote story first, kind of like I did with the therapist. And then something in my head was saying, that's not the whole story, and you need to say this. And I think in that moment, I really was just thinking about my relationship with you, and that I wanted you to understand my story, because we're such good friends and become important brothers to one another. And so I just felt like I couldn't tell the story about my dad without naming that, not because he was a part of it, of that abuse, but because that abuse was also a part of how I thought about who I was as a person, who I was as a man, and all the things that all the negative things that my father said to me that were, pretty much a lot of toxic masculinity and homophobia. And I just feel like that particular experience was a very traumatic and particular, that experience said a certain message to me about who I was and my worthiness. And so to feel unworthy, to feel ashamed, to feel wounded, and to have a father that is distant, and when he is present is saying all of these awful things, that's just another layer. He wasn't a part of the abuse, but of that sexual abuse, but his verbal abuse just kind of mixed in with that. And without telling you that I was a survivor, you wouldn't understand why his words had such impact on me.
Yeah, I found that there's some other places I want to go with that real quick, but one of the things I realized, Michael Ray mentioned therapy in his sermon, and I've been in therapy for over a decade, and it's been an amazing, liberating journey to really feel like a weight is lifted in so many areas of life. But what I've learned is that the power of the testimony through storytelling and the good news of a story ending well isn't based on what happened to any of us, but what we've been able to do with what happened. And be that turn it into something positive or live in the pain. I've found, as I've traveled with this book, a lot of people live in the pain and have this toxic relationship with pain that justifies their anger. I need to hold the pain so that I can stay angry. In fact, if I let go of the pain, I don't even know who I would be without this anger. And so this anger is still comforting me with the unspoken expectation that one day this anger will yield peace. And the reality is that anger never promised peace. It just promised you more anger. What I found in surrendering my anger for all that happened, that hurt me, and the things that didn't happen that I needed, was that on the other side of healing, my pain has to submit. And when pain submits to your healing, you are then able to use the pain as medicine. A friend of mine says if you can pass down trauma, you can also pass down healing. And the only way you can pass down healing is to address and overcome the trauma. It doesn't mean that it didn't happen, it just means that it doesn't have to keep happening and how we show up. But on the other side of healing, the pain submits, and now the pain becomes a tool to give back to the world as medicine through the power of testimony and healing. And I feel like in your story, which is of the 17, probably one of the hardest because of the verbal abuse, can we call it that? Yes. But then the medicine is so rich in how you raise your son and the level of affection and love that you share with him. And was it the case that what you lacked from your father emotionally, the reason why you raised your son so differently?
Yes, indeed. I think I share in the book that I was really worried when we were expecting about whether or not we would have a son, because I was afraid that I would do to him what my dad did to me. I didn't know how that was possible, but I knew enough to know that whatever is going on in my dad is somehow in me too. And is this young person going to have a difficult life because I'm not aware of myself and the impact that I have on him? So I had to make some very strong decisions, not so much in defiance of my father, but just a real commitment to want to heal. And, he was born when I was 29. So those 30s while I was in therapy, I was doing a lot of work around forgiving my dad and really trying to forgive myself in advance for whatever I didn't get right with my son. And to trust that the one thing that I didn't get from my father growing up was the only thing I really could offer my son, and that was affection and affirmation. And so I was very committed to that.
I think that for me, in the conversation and in the book, one of the most powerful statements you made was you talked about, they have this beautiful relationship when your son was young, and how you would hug him and pray over him. Mm-hmm. And what did you say? How did that go? Well,
it's from the scriptures. It's often a benediction at the end of a lot of services. And it's in the Hebrew Bible. I'm forgetting exactly the citation, but it's the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you, be gracious unto you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen. Good night, Keenan. And I would do that, and when he was little, I would pick him up and I would rub his back as I recited those words. And his godmother suggested that we bless him every night with these words. And I don't know what her agenda was, but we followed this agenda, and we prayed that prayer over him. And even as he got bigger, when I couldn't pick him up, there was still this rubbing of his back when I would recite those prayers. And today, when we part, I don't recite the prayers, but I make that circle in his back, and he just looks at me. He knows, I know what that means. I said, I got you. I got you. I see you. God's got you too.
Yes, it's beautiful.
Yeah.
I remember it stuck with me because in a part of the story you talked about how you were not afraid of being affectionate and showing affection and hugging and kissing your son, and you made the comment, I'm not concerned with how the idea of his manhood. Right. I'm more concerned with making sure my son is whole.
That's right. That's right.
And that hit me like a ton of bricks because I was raised in an environment where wholeness was not the agenda. And what I
Nor
found,
was hugging.
Nor was what?
Hugging.
Oh, hugging it never happened. Unless someone was so drunk that they weren't sure they were gonna make it, they would give you a hug and say, I love you, right? Some of us have been there. Where it's like, oh, I'll never do this again, God. But it was an environment, and what I've learned and through the lens of these stories and in revisiting my own, I think sometimes I found that parents, and after this we can probably take some questions if there are any, I wish my family, my uncles and my grandfather especially, my mom, through most of my childhood, from probably 11 through 16 when I left, suffered from alcohol abuse and addiction to drugs. And so I lived with my grandparents through that time. I now realize that my uncles and my grandfather were raising me through the lens of a set of assumptions. And those assumptions were, if his life is going to be like ours, a life full of difficulty and challenge and struggle, if life is going to be hard, then he's going to need the same set of skills that we needed in order to survive. And so they equipped me through the lens of life is hard, life is struggle, you're gonna have to be a fighter. You don't have time to feel nor permission to feel because feelings are dangerous. Because the assumption was that his life will not rise above the level of what we've lived through. And so he's gonna need what we needed. I wish they had a vision for who I could become that extended beyond our circumstances and their own personal journeys in life. But I also realized that even if they had a vision for who I could become beyond their personal struggles and challenges, they were never equipped to prepare me for a life that wasn't struggle and surviving. They didn't know how to equip me for a life of thriving, a life of joy, a life of peace. They only knew life through the lens of struggle and fighting, and it's hard. And so that's going to be you too. I wish they had the faith to pray and ask God for a vision that was bigger than that. That was bigger than struggle and pain and strife. But a life, what would it look like to have joy and peace and stability and safety? And they would have then had to have learned the skills to even offer me that. And in raising my own son, I started out like my family members did. I was giving him what they had given me, and none of what I was giving him was useful. He was not going to be who I was. Thank God for that. But I had to learn new skills. So my last question to you, and then we'll open the floor to questions. Do you feel that there were skills you might have passed down to your son that were not useful? And a part two of that, do you feel that in the journey of raising him, there were new skills you had to learn?
I'm sure there's a long list if I really think about it. What's coming to mind for me right now has to do with being comfortable in play with him. I was such a serious child. And that was fun. Sometimes that was my nickname, Setio. That I sometimes have a hard time playing. And little kids want you to play with them. They want you to imagine the world and get down on the floor and do that. And they want to go outside and throw the ball and catch the ball. You know, and I was afraid I would throw the ball and it wouldn't go to where he was. And he would throw the ball back to me and I wouldn't catch it. And then I'd be revealed, exposed as the same little, you know, kid that couldn't play sports. I could run. I ran. I was good. I was a good sprinter. I knew how to run for people. So I think that there is, I think one thing my son would say is that he wished that I was more present to him. And you know, I think we're still working on like, what does it mean for us to just enjoy each other's presence, just be together. He feels very comfortable with his mom. He loves me, and I know he knows that I love him. But I think we haven't found that way of playing together. That would be the one thing that.
So you still have to learn to play.
I think so, and I think I have to learn to play, just like period. I mean, look at me.
That doesn't mean you can't play. It's interesting you say that.
I'm just saying, I'm always very serious. So what does it mean to play?
Last night we went to dinner at this Korean barbecue, and there's all this amazing food, and I'm like in the chair doing my happy dance, and I'm like, I'm so happy right now, and he's like, yes, I can hear it in your voice. I was like, relax, man. But a week ago, I was in Myrtle Beach with a group of clergy leaders, and the first day I saw this video. It was the skipping challenge. And they were asking all of these adults who've seen it, do you remember how to skip? And so I had to give it a shot. So I went outside the hotel, and I'm literally skipping like in front of the hotel. And I still have it, still skip. But they were showing people who forgot. And I felt like after that, and I shared it in the talk there, the underlying question to do you remember how to skip is actually, do you remember how to play? And there are people who have forgotten how important play is. And we think that because we're adults now, we don't get to play anymore. But everywhere I go, and all of the innovative companies that I follow, whenever they're ideating for innovation, the first thing they do is go outside and play. Be silly. Get over yourself. Relax. No one's really paying as much attention as you think. And they play, and it opens you up to, I believe that a part of healing is found in play, that we can redeem those moments that we didn't have as children, that were taken away from us for whatever reasons, and through having that agency now and giving ourselves permission to play as a part of our healing and evidence of being free and in our liberation, that I have so much power over my own presence that I choose to play without being constrained by so many things that society tells us about ourselves. So I'll just say choose to play every now and then. If you can skip, you know, I realize that for some of us, I'm 53, the older we get, things like that are medical considerations at the same time. Knees and backs don't work the same. But find a version of play that fits your health insurance. Are there any questions?
Thank you very much. Actually, I wasn't even sure, didn't realize I was going to be here this long, but this topic is just so timely in my life. And I'm going to get the book. So do you have any stories of men who have adopted sons or sons who have adopted them? As a grown man, I have a son who's 40, and he adopted me about maybe 15 years ago because of the trauma that he's gone through in his life. And I don't have the full story of all of it, but as I was listening to the two of you talk, I'm like, that's my son, and I'm hoping he's watching online. He didn't want to come because Jackie wasn't preaching, and I'm like, texting him, like, you should be here watching it. But do you have any advice in terms of, you talk about the healing for young men who, well, for parents who have adopted young men who are grown and have not had the benefit of going through the processes that you've gone through?
Yeah, in the book, so there are 17 stories, and the beauty of the stories is they transcend cultural ethnicities and age. I have one person in the book who's under a pseudonym. His family owns an international brand that all of you would know. He actually wanted to use his real name, and I was like, no, the lawsuit. Because he was really honest about the relationship with his dad in some good ways. And I have someone who grew up sharecropping with his dad and tells the story of how when he left Arkansas to go to LA to find work, he was so excited that he had, I think, $10 and the whole chicken, and how excited he was to get the whole chicken. But there are stories of men who were raised by someone who wasn't their biological father. And there are stories for men who have been a part of raising children who were not their biological children and what that has looked like for them. So yes, and then the takeaways as well. Are there any other questions? We have a few minutes. Yes.
I just want to first start by thanking you both for being here and for your sermon in particular. I was thinking actually about your testimony and how the women in your life may have responded to your story sharing. And so I'm curious in your book potentially, or if you want to expand more on the women in your lives, what does that look like? How have women responded to this book? How have the men who have shared their story look to how their relationships, both potentially with their dads, but also with their mothers and women in their lives, been affected by this?
Sure. And also to loop in a bit of your point too, there's another book I want to tell you about, but I won't tell you about it because we're doing the Romal Toon book. There's another book that I think picks up on some of what you were talking about. And also say that, and he's probably watching, Robert Wilkins is a minister and was a youth mentor who I call Dad, and we have had an adopted relationship. He's been a very important part of my healing journey, and has been very helpful in helping me give grace to my own father. So that has made a difference, and I think I mentioned all the spiritual mamas, and I have a lot of spiritual mamas, like a lot. And the stuff that I couldn't say to men, I told it all to these women. And they embraced me and they helped me understand, how beautiful I am in the midst of my woundedness. And it's made all the difference in the world. Also, my mother, only just recently read the book because I was trying to figure out how long I could go without confessing that I had told the story. And when she read the book, she and I had a long conversation about all the things that she could see as a mother in our relationship and all the things that she was trying to do in the background to try to fix things. And it helped me understand a number of things that my father did to try to reach out to me and the role that she played in trying to help us heal in a very silent way. And it made all the difference in the world for me. My sister, that has been such a powerful experience as well, because we grew up in the same house, we had the same father, and yet we had very different experiences. And I think what telling this story has done for us is that it's allowed her to understand me a little bit more, to see how we're from the same pie, but I got more of the pecans, all the nuts, and she got more of the, of the sugar. It has also given her space to share things with me about her journey, and we're seeing each other in ways that we didn't see each other before. Yeah.
I think for me, women have been responding very positively to the book because the book is the human experience of relationship with a parent, and I've had, even in the reviews, if you look on Amazon, and I've had women say to me that the book is helping them heal and look at their challenges and difficulties with their dads. I'm a father of two. I have a son who's 22. That's him on the banner, and I have a daughter who's 24. My son and I have done an interview. My daughter and I have not. I'm far more afraid of my daughter. But I found in my personal journey, women have been the reason that I'm still alive, starting with my grandmother, who gave me permission to leave when I was 16, to leave California and a very, very challenging life in the inner city that I knew I had to get away from if I was going to live. And her words to me were, "There's nothing here for you. I will miss you, but you should go." That was a decision that probably saved my life. Because of my relationship with my grandmother, I have always been able to embrace women with power and leadership authority, because I've always been under that power and leadership through the lens of my grandmother. I literally used to sit at her feet and watch what she calls shoot 'em ups, cowboy movies, right? And just fall asleep in front of her. So because of that posture, most of my mentors that have been truly helpful in my career and life trajectory have been strong, courageous women with power. As opposed to men, it's been a lot more challenging because there's a perceived threat and all of these other dynamics that have made it difficult to have male mentors who probably saw the same things that women saw, but the women were not afraid of it. And so any skills, any wisdom I've attained and opportunities have oftentimes come through strong, courageous women opening doors for me. And through the lens of the book, in fact, when you read the reviews, like most of the reviews are actually women who are reading on behalf of someone and prepping them for their opportunity to share this book with their son or their brother or their grandfather or their dad, or someone or some group of people who need a tool. And we found that the book has become it gives people permission to start having conversations and to start thinking through things that have been these ghosts in relationships. You know, my son and I are still on a healing journey, but what I'm grateful for is there's no more ghosts in the room when we engage. We have started having the difficult, hard, uncomfortable conversation. And I did that not for myself, but I did not want him carrying stuff that was never his to begin with. And after interviewing the first three men, I realized that if the book was going to be honest, I had to do the same thing and create that space. And hold those truths with open hands. And that's probably the hardest thing we can do sometimes, is do enough work on yourself to let other people who have experienced you in difficult ways tell you about yourself without defending it and explaining away. But it's their truth and it's their story that oftentimes just creating that space for them to share the difficulty and what they wished had happened is a part of the healing and the beginning of the process of forgiveness. One last thing, I think we're out of time. I found that people who no longer have their parent here ask the question, well, why bother now? My parent's no longer alive. What can I do? And what I've learned from therapists and I've learned in life are several things. One, your healing is not dependent upon anyone's apology. That you do not have to concede the power of your journey and your healing to waiting on or never receiving an I'm sorry. Because the first person you can forgive is yourself for holding it so long and letting it blind you to your journey. So healing can still happen in the absence of an apology. And therapy can take you on a process and a journey of what that looks like for you. The other thing when the person is not available is that you owe it to yourself to figure out how to confront that pain, make it submit to your healing so that you can give it back to the world as medicine. And so it's not a matter of if you can have the conversation with another person. It's more about, are you ready to be courageous enough to confront yourself? To be honest about the sadness, the sorrow, the anger, and what it has done to you. Isaiah 61:3, the tattoo I have on my arm, God will give you joy for mourning, praise for despair, and beauty for ashes. That's an exchange. Joy for mourning, praise for despair, beauty for ashes. And the journey of healing and finding medicine to offer others is that process of surrendering the ashes in order to receive beauty. And for some of us, I think it's that naming those ashes, that pain, those missed moments, and surrendering it to receive beauty that's still available to you. So thank you for staying after worship today, and I guess we'll be in the hallway.
Yeah, there's actually one more question just from the online. We want to grab one from the online people. There's some of them still in there.
Okay.
As someone who was raised as a son who was in fact not, this person's transgender, I'm curious if the question of assigning gender to children and how that changes the relationship comes up.
Yeah, so that is a conversation that's beginning to happen when I'm out and people are honest enough to ask the question. This is only the second time, so thank you for the question. What I found in that conversation, and I actually had 2 people I wanted to interview for the book, and they refused. They were like, I love you, but if I tell the whole truth in the book, it will destroy my family. And I said, but I know your family. It's already hurting everyone. And his response was, yeah, we've learned to deal with that pain. And that saddened me because he's a dear friend. And I remembered a friend of mine, a pastor and a spiritual healer. She said, you know, it's like a kid playing on the playground and gets a splinter and runs and says, Mom, I have a splinter. And she says, let me take it out. And the kid says, no, it's gonna hurt. I'd rather deal with the pain I know, even if this new pain on the other side of it is healing. And that's where we have this unhealthy relationship sometimes with pain. So in regards to the question, I don't think that there's one easy answer to it. I think that the book opens up the door for people to begin to have the conversation of what did I need? And how did, and I think especially Michael Ray's story deals with it a little bit, how did it impact me not living into these ideas and instructions of who I was supposed to be that actually didn't serve who I really was well? And when you read some of these stories, you'll find that the way a couple of these dads parented was actually through the lens of their own trauma and the potential or threat of abuse. And the fear that they didn't want that to happen to their own child. And so, again, the book becomes a tool to begin to have some conversations that are long overdue.
Thank you so much for that. Can we give them a round of applause? Yeah. Romal's book, I Wish My Dad, is out here in the, if you didn't pass it on the way in. And you can have some more questions or answers from him if you'd like out there. You can also purchase the book. And thank you all for coming. Thank you all for staying. Have a blessed week.